In Chapter 2, we're going to talk about the model code process and other agencies that help build standards for our fire protection systems. And we would be remiss about talking about fire protection systems without going into and understanding where these codes and these requirements for these systems comes from. Our objectives for this chapter: define the terms code and model code. Name the two most prominent model code organizations. Describe the International Code Council, the model code development process. Describe the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, model code and development process. Define the terms reference standard and code amendment. Describe the advantages to governments and organizations that adopt model codes. List the two most important code-related conditions that determine the installation requirements for fire protection systems. Building and fire codes provide information for all parties involved in the construction of buildings and maintain occupant safety throughout the life of a building. Many parties have to deal with codes and standards on an everyday basis, such as design professionals, contractors, government officials, and fire officials, to name a few. Unfortunately, these parties give little consideration to the authors of the codes and the code development and adoption process. To understand the origins and significance of building, fire, and life safety issues and requirements, it is important to know how the development process works. To understand the model code process, it is necessary to understand the terms code and model code. First, code, a system of rules, regulations, or laws that is usually put into effect by governments and has the statutory authority to be enforced. A code states essentially what a person can and cannot do. Basically, if you violate a code, you can be fined or arrested. A model code is a system of rules, guidelines, methods, and regulations usually developed by private nonprofit organizations. Nonprofits provide a forum for interested parties to come together to debate, modify, reject, and approve rules and regulations. Such groups and committees can be technical committees, governments, and the general public. Once approved, the rules, regulations, and process become available for local, state, and federal governments and agencies to adopt. By adopting the model into law, the government implements the code for all to follow. So basically, a model code is a recommendation for government agencies and building professionals to follow when building a building. However, these individuals, these construction workers and contractors, do not have to follow the model code, which is best practices, unless it has been adopted as code by the local authority having jurisdiction. Let's look at the history of the development of codes and standards now. Initially, insurance companies and related organizations developed codes and standards to reduce property loss caused by fire problems. As we know throughout history, such major fires as the Great Fire of London and the Boston Fire really promulgated, insurance companies to kind of step in and say, hey, what we're doing now is not working, and we're tired of paying out all this money, we're going to go broke. So if you want us to insure your property, you need to do these minimum requirements, thus reducing their fire loss that they were having to pay out. Later on, model code organizations expanded their roles in the code development process, become the primary writers, promoters, and promulgators of model codes and standards. And there were several different groups and entities writing these codes. You had building officials and code administrators, the BOCA. You had the International Conference of Building Officials, the ICBO, the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, and the Southern Building Code Congress International, abbreviated as SBCCI. However, in the mid-1990s, the BOCA, the ICBO, and the SBCCI merged to form the International Code Council. And this was directly in reflect to the fact that these organizations were all basically doing the same work, but for different areas and regions of the government. Unfortunately, you had each group, an organization, and they were kind of making the rules for their areas, and it didn't really have a state standard, the same standard. So you may have one making building requirements for, say, Georgia, and another making building requirements for Alabama. And both of them didn't exactly agree. So it became cost prohibitive and ineffective for these builders to try to compete back and forth across state lines. So the resolution came about in the mid-1990s after NAFTA and such things as the European Union came about to standardize this process so it would enable fair competition amongst all different agencies. Today, the ICC and the NFPA are the primary developers and publishers of the model building and fire codes for local, state, and federal governments. NFPA also develops and publishes many standards used by government, design, and industry professionals. The work of these organizations has led to a national code development process. To recap, it is important to remember in the 1990s that the BOCA, ICBO, and SBCCI merged to form the ICC, which stands for the International Code Council. And today, the International Code Council and National Fire Protection Agency, NFPA, are the two primary developers for the model building codes. So what is the purpose of these groups and who are they made up of? And the groups of interested parties come together to propose, debate, and reject or adopt changes to existing codes and standards. And the purpose is to develop and maintain building, fire, mechanical, plumbing, electrical, and other related codes and standards and recommended practices. The groups operate independent of the influences of pressure from specialized interest group. And the staff of these organizations support the process, but the members do the development work and vote on proposed changes. So these groups are made up by industry professionals, technical experts, and basically anyone that has to do with the process, from the architect to the end user to the people that manufacture the building products, and they're all invited to be a member of these organizations. And they get together and they work out a compromise on technology, trends, and testing in terms of what they feel is the most applicable changes to a standard in terms of construction requirements and things of that nature. The International Code Council, again, was the organization that evolved in the early 1990s as a result of political events that had international implications, such as the NAFTA and the European Union, that allowed it trade in a common currency among these global powers. This event put the regional code development system under scrutiny, and the technical discrepancies between the models came to light, and the need to come up with one uniform set of code was identified. In 1994, when these groups all came together to develop and maintain the International Code Series, they gave all the individual smaller groups, these little individual entities that were on separate organizations, to the year 2000 to stop publishing their standard and then solely go with the ICC Model Code Series. So now let's look at the development process of the code, now that we understand where the organization came from, who's in it, and why. The ICC code development process is open to all, but structured to avoid dominant by special interest groups. It is open to all public groups, and all actions and their rationales are published for public view. Any interested party can participate, including those with material interest and outcome. But at least 1/3 of each committee is composed of government officials. Government-affiliated members vote on the code changes proposed by the committee. The code revision cycle, because every so often you need to update these standards, used to occur every 18 months, with new editions published every 3 years. Currently, the 15 codes that are out there are divided into 2 review groups, with groups reviewed on alternating years. And in the 3rd year, all codes are prepared for publication. Publication date is set 6 to 8 months before the next cycle starts. Steps of the ICC code development process are as follows, and it would behoove you to know each step and the particulars in each step, as there are quite a few quiz and test questions on it coming up. Step 1, submit code changes, and that's basically anyone may submit a change before the announced due date. Once submitted, the ICC staff reviews proposals prior to publication distribution, and the ones are then selected to be put out. And that's in step 2, the post and distribution of the code changes. The ICC staff posts recommended changes online 45 days in advance of the code development public hearing, and distributes them via CD 30 days in advance. Advanced distribution allows review by all interested parties. Step 3, the committee action hearing. And that's when public hearing occurs at the ICC National Conference. All interested parties can submit their views, and then the appropriate code development committees vote to approve as submitted, approve as modified, or disapprove depending on the outcomes of the discussion. If there are objections, the committee's decision will be discussed by the attendees. Once the discussion concludes, only eligible ICC members vote on the change. And the change is ratified if there's a simple or 2/3 majority, depending on what the change is. Step 4, post and distribute committee action results. All hearing results are posted on the website within 30 days and on a CD in 45 days. Step 5, public hearing and comments. Interested parties are able to consider specific objections to the results of the public hearing and prepare comments. The discussion, however, is limited. This step occurs 60 days before the annual ICC conference. Step 6. Post and distribute public comment. The ICC staff conducts a review similar to Step 1. Results are distributed on the website 45 days prior to public comment hearing and on CD 30 days prior. Step 7. Public committee hearing considerations. Consideration of all proposed changes occur at a hearing which is open to the public and allows anyone to participate in general floor discussion. Only active ICC governmental members in attendance can vote to make the process free of being properly influenced by outside Either a simple majority or a 2/3 majority may be required to pass the code. If a proposed change does not receive the required majority, the final action recorded is disapproved. Finally, in Step 8, they publish the new edition. As soon as possible, the final changes are published and made available for all. Any changes are published in the next supplement or new edition of the model code. These steps are necessary to ensure an open, balanced, and consensus-based code development process, free of outside influences. Now, let's look at the NFPA. The NFPA organization dates to 1895, when the multiple existing fire sprinkler system design and installation standards made it difficult for plumbers to keep track of where in each standard applied. A group of men affiliated with stock fire insurance organizations coverage to establish a uniform standard. The group published the report of Committee on Automatic Sprinkler Protection. And in 1896, the group outlined, reviewed, and adopted the Articles of the Association to deal with fire protection issues and officially formed the NFPA. So the sprinkler system standard was really the first bit of code that NFPA ever came up with or designed, and it was done out of necessity from the plumbers and the insurance companies trying to get a consensus standard. That way they could operate more easily without having to change from job to job and use different equipment and things of that nature. And it's important to note that that article, based on the sprinkler system, was renamed to NFPA 13, which is the standard for installation of sprinkler systems, and today is the most widely used sprinkler standard. Who makes up the NFPA? Originally, membership was limited to stock fire insurance organizations and their representatives. By 1904, trade, engineering, and industrial organizations and individuals were allowed to join. As membership grew, the NFPA took on a lot of new roles, such as providing public education, providing engineering publications, disseminating fire research information, and of course, developing codes and standards. Today, the NFPA publishes over 300 safety codes and standards, ranging over topics such as fire, building, electrical, processes, and life safety. The organization has 70,000 plus members from over 100 plus countries. NFPA is governed by the Standards Council, which is comprised of 13 members appointed by the Board of Directors. They are responsible for code and standard development activities, rules, regulations, and appeals. They are also responsible for overseeing technical committees. It is the primary consensus body responsibility for determining if a proposed codes or standard project will move forward. If it is approved, an existing technical committee will be assigned or a new one created to develop the code or standard that has been proposed. Membership of technical committees is diverse in terms of industry and organizational representatives. No more than 1/3 of a technical committee can be from the same interest group. And to take action on proposals, there must be a consensus reached by the voting members of the Standards Council. The NFPA development process for their codes applies to both new documents and revisions, and it can take anywhere from 101 to 141 weeks to complete. This process promotes an open and fair procedures. The NFPA development process is a little bit different. This one only has 4 basic steps in the process, all of which apply when developing the new document or revising an existing one. Step 1, the input stage. Interested parties submit proposals. They are then evaluated and voted on, and a first draft report is issued. Step 2, the comment stage. The appropriate technical committee meets to review all comments on the first draft report. Results are then published as a second draft report for the committee to vote on. Results are then posted for public review. If there are no public comments and the committee does not think there needs to be a revision, then the proposal goes to the Standard Council to be issued. Step 3, the association technical meeting. If a party is unsatisfied, they can file a notice of intent to make a motion. Notification places the issue in front of the NFPA membership at their annual meeting. Notification must follow proper procedures to be voted on. Once debated and voted on, any successful motion must be reviewed by the responsible committee. Step 4, Council Appeals and issuance of standards. When the council convenes to issue new standards, it also hears appeals from groups that are unhappy with the standard as proposed. The council ensures all procedures were followed and the process was fair. If appropriate, an official from NFPA standard is issued. The decision is final and effective 20 days after approval, but must be subjected to limited review by the board of directors. Proposals that require no action are sent to the Standard Council and issued as a consent standard. The NFPA process promotes open and fair procedures. Anyone can participate and provide input, but final responsibility rests with the technical committee. Now, let's talk about a reference standard, and this is a little different. To address all important and related issues thoroughly, code writers look outside of their organization for additional information. That information is the reference standard, and it is the term used to refer to documents published by other nationally recognized organizations with specific expertise. To be considered adoptable, a standard must go through a consensus process, be performance-based, not specify products or materials, and be mandatory, and be readily available. Reference standards provide specific information about design and installation requirements, and specific standards referenced in the model code text become part of the code. They are listed by the year they are published. Now I know this can be a little confusing. What is the difference between model codes and reference standards? And to sum it up basically, a model code is what to do and where, and the reference standard is how to do it. So let's say that the model code states that you have to have a sprinkler system in a building that is a child care center. Well, it's not going to tell you how to do it. That is going to be the reference standard, and they will tell you how to properly install the sprinkler system. And then remember that the model code can be adopted as code by the authority having jurisdiction or the local government. So when they do that, that's how they can enforce the code, because you have the model code, which tells you what to do and where, and then the reference standard tells you how to do it. That way you make sure things are done appropriately and the right materials and equipment is used. So the advantage of using a reference standard: instead of writing thousands of pages of additional code, model code organizations can reference specific documents to facilitate project design and installation requirements. These standards make enforcement possible. In the next couple of slides, you see different organizations that are referenced for standards and where to find them. The 2012 edition of the International Building Code listed 55 different organizations as providers of reference standard material. And in the 2012 edition of NFPA 5000 Building Construction and Safety Code, it listed 19 organizations as well as referencing NFPA standards and other references published. Both model code systems rely on standards published by the NFPA when dealing with requirements for fire protection systems. So now, taking it full circle, now that we have these codes developed from the reference standard, or I should say model codes, because technically they're not codes yet. These model codes are out there by these two organizations, and now the government can adopt the ICC and NFPA codes. And again, that makes it enforceable by law when it becomes a code. This is a cost-effective and practical, and it allows these organizations not to focus on this complicated process, and kind of help make sure that it's fair and compliant with all parties. Now, this doesn't say that government officials can't write their own standard that they use as a code. And many times they do. But what they do is they look at the model code and then they trim it up or amend it to fit the specific needs of the community. It's important to note that model codes establish the minimum level of performance and risk. This does not mean that jurisdictions and insurance carriers can't say, hey, we want a higher level of protection, whatever it may be, from more firewalls to a better heat resistant rating or more sprinkler systems. And that's where a lot of times the government agencies come in to kind of tweak and adjust these model codes before they're making them codes. Now, amendments supersede model codes and usually occur at the state or local level. Now, they have an interesting section in the text here about code requirements and fire protection systems. You would think that all buildings will be required to be sprinklered. However, That is not the case. Now, you may know that today, many modern skyscrapers are all required to have sprinkler systems. But prior to the 1980s, they were not. And as a result of catastrophic fires, the code was changed to make them have sprinkler systems. Now, if you have a building that was put into place prior to a code, then that structure is essentially grandfathered in as long as the occupancy and what it does doesn't change. They are not required to update to the new standard. An important thing to note, depending on which code organization you look at, they're going to dictate based off of these categories what fire protection things need to be in place. And you can look at the International Code Council here on the left side of your screen, and their classifications are assembly, business, educational, factory and industrial, high hazards, institutional, mercantile, residential, storage, utility, and miscellaneous. So let's see, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 classifications. And all buildings fall into one of those classifications for the ICC. NFPA is similar, but they have a few extra. They have 12. And those are assembly, business, daycare, detention and correction, educational, healthcare, healthcare ambulatory, industrial, mercantile, residential, residential board and care, and storage. With the introduction of new construction and design methods, there has been an added confidence in the sprinkler system, resulting in some increase and decrease in other performance and construction characteristics. For example, what they're talking about here is some increases include a longer travel distance to exits, meaning you don't have to have an exit every, say, 100 feet. It's been stretched to 200 feet due to the protection system. Reduction in the construction requirements for existing based on the assumption that a properly constructed sprinkler system will protect the occupants and allow sufficient time for exiting. Some codes include incentives to install automatic sprinkler systems in buildings not ordinarily required to have them. When structures are made out of a combustible material such as wood, they are limited in size and height and the number of stories allowed. But if they want to increase in these parameters are permitted if the sprinkler system is installed. So it gives the builder and the architect an incentive, and that helps maximize the use of the property, protect the occupants, and protect the building itself. Model construction codes attempt to balance hazards. And what I mean by hazards includes the structure itself, the combustible content, the floor areas above and below ground level that make fighting fire a challenge for firefighters, and of course the cost of construction. Incorporating fire protection systems in design makes the balance easier to achieve. Now, installing fire protection system makes good business sense because it doesn't cause that interruption of business, which can be harmful more than just the loss and fire damage. Because let's think about it. If a business catches fire, they're going to lose some of their competitive edge because while they're having to rebuild the entire structure, they're going to be closed and not providing that service to the public. So the public is going to look elsewhere to get that service. And then once that building is rebuilt, they may not be able to recapture the original customers, thus causing it to go out of business. Also, you have the loss of employees. When the business is destroyed, you can't employ your employees, and they're forced to look for employment elsewhere. Insurers like protection systems because the water damage can be cleaned up faster and cost less than rebuilding the entire structure. And depending on the scope and magnitude of the fire, the businesses can open back up, possibly in hours, weeks, or days, as opposed to months or even years, or possibly not at all. Let's now review some of the key concepts for this chapter. Building and fire codes provide a uniform and consistent standard and guidelines for all parties to ensure public safety in buildings. A code is a system of rules, regulations, or laws, usually developed by government, that has the statutory authority to be enforced. It is established what a person or entity can or cannot do. Again, a code is basically like a law where people can be imprisoned or fined for violation of said code. A model code is a system of rules, guidelines, and methods and regulations that is typically developed by a private, not a government agency, a private organization, which is a not-for-profit organization, and is available to governments for adoption. Currently now, we only have two organizations that come up with the model code, and that is the ICC and the NFPA. The model code establishes the minimum, remember that, the minimum level of performance and risk. But there are situations where a problem needs special consideration, and the model code does not adequately address the potentially higher risk or hazard. Under these circumstances, those with the authority write amendments to the code and write different requirements, such as your local government, to tailor that model code to meet the needs of their community. It is important to know who within any state or local jurisdiction establishes the requirements and how the process works regarding the adoption of model codes for building, fire, and life safety. Installations of fire protection systems are generally a result of a code adoption by the government to protect the life and safety of the occupants. Fire protection systems are part of a code based that make the installation financially attractive and are a condition of insurance or are an element to manage the risk, ensure business continuity.